welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. And I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you are interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossin.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm very excited for this because we talked a lot about open source. We talk a lot about technology in general. And I think this is one of the first times that we're actually going to talk to somebody whose job is open source, like completely open source. And I want to introduce Josh Goldberg. Josh, you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'll note you have a very loose definition of job that I happen to adhere to.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah, I do it full time in that I spend my working hours mostly in open source or talking about open source like this, both of which I love and enjoy. But I don't work for any particular company. I'm independent, which means that my sponsorship, my funding comes from contributors online, corporate sponsors, individual, and book sales because I wrote a book on TypeScript. So, hey everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Josh.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about all sorts of things around the open source community. I also want to talk about your book. As somebody who has played around with the idea of writing a book, I'd love to kind of have some candid conversations about that. Usually I like to start my conversations with origin stories. Like, I would love to hear, your origin story to technology. When was the first time that, technology presented itself to you and you realized like, hey, this is something that I'm very interested in, and I kind of like to make a life out of it?
It was video games.
Yes.
I was a very sad, lonely little child, and the computer was fun. And I remember we played this game, Spooky Castle, The Adventures of Kid Mystic, and then Age of Empires and The Sims, and later on Halo. And I just really enjoyed that and kind of thinking analytically of what are the rules of this game? What are the algorithms, I would later call them, of how this world is constructed? And I think thinking analytically like that was really good preparation for thinking in terms of computers and coding.
Yeah, it's so funny because, and I'm not going to try to discern your age, but I think that you and I are of a similar vintage. And, depending on, and as I've had these conversations, I've figured this out. I mean, it's probably an incorrect assumption or observation. Depending on what time frame you were born, you had different introductions to computing or technology, whether it was CDs in the mail or, reading coding magazines and having to write the code from hand. MySpace, like building profiles in MySpace. And for some of us, that introduction to like video games was like, oh man, like I love playing video games. Like, what if I built video games as like a job? And then I think, I don't know what your thoughts are, but like you talk to people who actually build video games as a job and you're like, oh, maybe not so much, right? So what was it specifically about, obviously the video game thing? I'd love to, dive into a little bit about the loneliness of being a kid that likes technology, because I felt like it was like that for me at times. Like, what was it about video games, do you think? Was it the community aspect of it? Was it the stepping outside of like the real world and like getting to play, like you mentioned Age of Empires, like playing in like, the medieval times, or, Halo, playing, space age? Like, was it being able to kind of dismiss reality a little bit, or was the community aspect of it that was more interesting for you initially?
I think initially and for most of the time, it has not been the community. For me, the community in the games mostly has been secondary, with the exception of a period of a couple of years when I was a teenager. But I always liked, even before video games, Legos, the act of building things, putting them together, figuring out, again, the analytical rules and mastering them. So when I was playing games, even when it was something like Halo, which is combat oriented, not building, I was always trying to perfect something, whether it was like perfect my Byzantine Empire or perfect my ability to three headshot someone with a pistol in Combat Evolved. It was always towards build something as a goal.
Yeah.
And then that translates really well to computers and coding for me, because I'm still trying to figure out that puzzle, the way to build something the best way, given all these basic building blocks of, let's say, for loops and functions rather than villagers and militiamen.
Yeah, I love the anecdote, like that, like being able to, about problem solving, because we talk about technology a lot as just like a amalgamation of tools to solve some problem, right? And I love, you equating like loops and functions and conditionals to like practical pieces in like some non-computer sciencey way. I think that's great. And you mentioned Lego too, like the making aspect or the curiosity things. Were you a genuinely curious kid? Like you wanted to know how things worked? I've told the story a million times in the show, so I apologize to folks who listen. Like the taking apart stuff and putting it back together was like very big for me growing up. Like I disassembled the first computer we ever got like the second day we had it, which was interesting because I didn't know how to put it back together. I had to figure that out. And so like was the tinkering or the curiosity of how things work, was that a driving force for a lot of things as well?
Sort of. I've always been pretty garbage with hardware.
Sure, sure,
It's
sure.
not that I disrespect or don't believe in working at the hardware level. It's just not something that's ever come naturally to me. So I've always been kind of scared. I've only once attempted to build a computer. I had to call in a couple friends,
Mm,
and that did not go well before then. But I do consider myself, yeah, a very curious person, and I want to know if something is in front of me, what are the rules that govern it? How can I most efficiently use this thing? So that again was a direct driver there for the
yeah.
topic of getting into computers.
Do you typically there's this way of thinking where it's like you're either right brain or left brain, right? Where you're hyper analytical, you tend to like things like math and science, and then there's kind of like the people that are more right brain oriented, so there's more creativity or they like art. Do you kind of feel yourself falling into one camp or the other? And the reason why I ask, I have a reason for asking, and I'm just generally curious. Like, would you, I guess, pigeonhole yourself into one of those two different ways of thinking?
No, I wouldn't. I think that it can be useful to think in terms of AB, left brain,
Yeah.
right brain, INTJ versus whatever, Myers-Briggs, in certain contexts. But generally, humans are so complex. Even a cat is so complex as a mind that
So
it's really
true.
difficult to generally align it towards these like one or two or four dimensional even axes. Like I really enjoy thinking analytically and getting that mathematical perfection. My dad was a math professor
Mm.
for quite a few decades, and I think I got a lot of love for finding the optimal, correct, beautiful, clean way of things from him. But that doesn't mean that I don't like being creative. I like thinking outside of the box, and I like finding a creative, unusual skew or take on things.
Yeah.
And I don't think those two are inherently in competition. I think there's a lot of root thought that goes into both of them. Like a lot of beautiful, say, mathematics or programming implementations have a lot in common with a lot of beautiful art
Mhm.
manifestations, where they take the existing status quo and find the most beautiful or like an unusual way to improve the state of the art for it. So all that is to say, I don't know. I can never even remember which one is left brain versus right brain. So you
Yeah.
tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I also have this whole belief that being a technologist is like just another way of being creative or artistic, right? Like, whether you like to paint or sculpt or free draw or whatever it is, or algorithms, right? Or trying to solve some problem. I mean, there's something to say too about most of the easy problems are already been solved, right? 1,000 times over, and all of them. There's tons of different opinionated ways to do that, but how us as technologists like make a living is by taking the tools and putting them all together to do something to bring some company business value, right?
Yeah.
Or in your case, like greater the community and sell your books and do all these sort of great things too, right? Um, I'd like to get your thoughts too about you know you got introduced to games and you like the idea of technology in that regard. Like when did you realize that you can make a career out of technology?
Hmm. It was around middle end of high school.
Mm,
I've always liked design. Never been particularly great at the visual arts, but I enjoy
sure.
Photoshop quite a lot. I used to Photoshop my friends' faces onto animals and vice
Oh,
versa. It was always a fun thing.
unrelated.
So
Have you ever seen like that
yeah,
Reddit, like the Photoshop Reddits where people like make
yeah,
amazing
yeah,
things? Oh my gosh, so good.
yeah.
Anyway, I
Photoshop
interrupt.
battles, Word
Yeah,
1000.
Photoshop battles. Yeah, I interrupted you. Continue your train of thought.
No, sure. So I was taking like graphics arts, like digital arts classes, and then I also took this was New York State curriculum, so Java, computer science,
Mm,
and both of them were really fun. Both of them satisfied that itch of I want to build things, I want to master the tools, I want to find those clean expressions. And then I looked at the expected salaries of like a visual designer versus a programmer,
yeah.
which already then was known to be quite different. Not that that's correct or fair in the broad context of society, just pragmatically speaking. And then I also started to get really, really into coding. I just really liked it. I was able to do these awesome little like calculators or mini games or whatever in Java. So that's kind of when I slid into that. And then I took a 4-year CS degree at RPI, which is a small engineering school in upstate New York. And since then, I've been pretty solidified on, yes, programming, computer development stuff as a career.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I'd love to kind of drill into a little bit. Like, firstly, the Java as a curriculum, right? I'd love to get your thoughts on opinionated course of study for computer science, right? I mean, the school that I went to, the reason why I didn't get a computer science degree is because I didn't want to build like ATMs with C or C++. So like, whenever I hear like, oh, I took my object-oriented programming class and it was Java, and then I took a lot of Java courses and now I'm a Java developer, right? I'd love to get your thoughts as to academia. And I know, knowing that your father is a professor, you probably have some opinions on academia in general. I'd love to get your thoughts as like course curriculum at universities, right? I think one of the things that a lot people knock isn't the right word, but people have opinions on as it pertains to academia is that it's somewhat slow moving as it pertains to adopting like new ways to build things. So a lot of computer science curriculums are you're learning C++ or Java, or even to extent like maybe C# or Ruby or something like that, but more modern technologies or technologies that I guess directly correlate to you getting a job, they're maybe not talked about as much. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that in general. And you can be as spicy or not spicy or avoidal as you like.
Sure. I'm just I'm amused because yeah, we both worked at Microsoft, and then you just phrase C# in the context of versus other more modern. C#
Yeah.
is a great language, but yeah, I don't know that I would teach with it or Java compared to others. It's a complex question, though. I'm not stating a preference for one versus another.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of competing factors here. And it's unfortunate because people try to oversimplify complex, nuanced topics, such as what is the right way for any given educational institute or
Sure.
set of institutes to teach things. For example, academia tends to be a little slower moving than, say, cutting edge tech. You see schools at high school level teaching Java for years after there were languages that arguably could be better suited or
Sure.
could be seen as better suited to intro development. So a few scattered thoughts here, if you want to drill in on any of them.
Please
One
scatter
is
them all
that,
over.
yeah, you don't need to be optimal. People are always asking when they're new to something, what's the best way to learn this? What's the
Yeah.
right way? There are a bajillion right ways. I learned Java first, and I haven't touched Java outside of teaching other people since, I don't know, a decade ago.
Yeah.
I also ended up learning C and assembly, and then also like Prolog and Haskell in some different forms during my college curriculum. And those were both really interesting and useful to know. So it matters less what you start with and more, how you approach the education. America also has a somewhat broken education system. Teachers at every level are not compensated fairly, which, in addition to being, morally repugnant to me, also is extremely inconvenient. It means that they don't have the bandwidth to really like go out and learn the latest and greatest technology.
Yeah.
That's why you have programs like TEALS and ScriptEd. It also means that a lot of university professors are not incentivized by teaching. Some are, but many are just incentivized by grants. So why would a college professor spend hours upon hours a week honing their curriculum when that does not almost at all, impact their compensation or reviews? So regardless of whether they want to, it's just the system is not set up to, really innovate what we teach students in colleges. And then, of course, colleges like mine cost thousands upon thousands of dollars a semester. So then you get boot camps, but boot camps are still a new, relatively unproven model, a lot of success, and also a lot of things learning the hard way, like it can be predatory to ask people for whatever 20% of their first income. So it's just an unsolved complex problem that you can't really boil down to small things.
And that was kind of the reason why I wanted to ask. You brought CodeCamp specifically, and we've all seen, or that's not fair. A lot of us have seen like Stack Overflow, developer surveys or different developer surveys from miscellaneous company X, right? And there's always a question that's like, how did you what's your education background for technology? And like if you looked at that graph 10 years ago versus now, like you'd see substantially more, self-taught technologists, people do code camps. And I think what's interesting about the code camp angle is what you just mentioned, like that you're going to learn technologies that can get you a job today. And I assume, like me, you at times have had the opportunity to mentor people that are getting started in tech or people that are in college and they have questions. And the only thing they care about is how do I get a job, right? So it seems very much like, to tell people, oh, go to a 4-year university or go to a 6-week code camp and learn Python or JavaScript or something, right? Like, but one of the things that I always found interesting about the code camp folks is that they eventually do have to go back and learn the principles, or they stagnate in their career, like they stay in this at that particular level because they can't think about things like performance, or they can't think about architecture design at the level that maybe somebody that took some classes like that at university could. Not to say you can't learn them on your own, but they're not forced in front of you like some college curriculums.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about like a 6 week or even like a 3 to 6 month boot camp, even if it condenses down to just the relevant stuff for a first tech job and removes a lot of the miscellaneous things, like my college biology class that I have
Sure.
never thought of since positively, it's inherently just not able to teach as many things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that the boot camps are bad. It's just that they have a different path towards the first result, pardon me, where that result is getting that first tech job. And just like with universities, there are pros and cons. I think one of the pros is, yeah, it's much more accelerated, which is a lot more cost effective. Then one of the cons is depending on the boot camp and how long yours takes, you might not have as well fleshed out. For those who don't know me intimately, I worked at Codecademy for a
Mm-hmm.
few years, and we worked quite a lot with self-taught learners, bootcamp folks. And time again, we would see that boot camps would teach the core concepts in a very even good way often. But in order to really flesh them out, you need to spend time practicing over and over again over the course of months. And when your whole boot camp lasts 3 months, you're just not emerging as well practiced. Now, that being said, I do want to caveat this because I don't want people to come away from this thinking that either of us are bashing boot camps, or that boot
Nope.
camps aren't great,
Nope.
or that self-taught or boot camp is not a totally valid, valuable way to get a job. Those are great ways to get a job in tech alongside, the other older ones like going to university. But you were right that it behooves one to practice the fundamentals, to really do personal projects or participate in open source, or if you can get an internship, do that before trying to get that first full-time role.
Yeah, I'm very much of the mindset that whatever we learn before we get our first job in tech usually is probably not going to help you out in the long run in your career. Like, very much like the way we progress in our career is from the things that we do while on the job, as well as the way we're working with people. Like, I had a manager tell me years ago, like, I can teach you how to do this. I can give you a book and give you 4 hours a day to read the book until you can do whatever, right? But I can't teach you how to be curious. I can't teach you how to want to innovate. Innovate's not the right word, but like look at different solutions for the same problem. Like, some of those things are on the job training and will only be on the job training, right? And one of the things that I struggle with, and you mentioned it specifically, as if I was to go back in time and would I decide to go down the path that I did, where I went to a 4-year university and got an information systems degree, or would I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be working in computers, like, period. And I sometimes think, like, a little bit of hindsight is like, did I make the right choices going to college? I think so, yes, because one, I met my wife at college, so that's a whole different conversation. So, like, that was worth the cost of admission, literally. But I'm always genuinely curious, like, for folks that go to code camps, and do they, you know, usually folks that go to code camps, they're starting tech later in their career too. So maybe they went to college for something else and they realize that there's more money in tech. But I'm always generally curious is, like, at some point in time, you do need to do both or some simulation of both. And when I think of both in the code camp sense, I'm like the self-taught learning or the guided learning that's not with a course curriculum, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite things about working with bootcamp folks and self-taught folks is that you get a greater diversity, both of people, but
Yes.
also more within that of experience. That folks are coming in with, say, art backgrounds or no consistent full-time job experience, just a series of, small part-time or minimum wage jobs. And that means that I get to chat with folks who have just completely different viewpoints or experiences to draw from. But yeah, at the end of the day, the skills that are useful and relevant for first getting that first job and then keeping the first job tend to be spread out amongst different types of things. Like networking or generally communicating with people, you can get through college group work and clubs and or through working with other people in an actual job and or through communities online, bajillion other ways of getting it. So whether you're, going to a boot camp and then going to conferences or just really active on Twitter, as
Hmm.
long as you're getting some of those core skills from somewhere, they can all
Yeah.
generally feed into helping you get that job, that placement.
Yeah. So moving on from, learning and how, you adopted these thought processes around technology, like eventually you did how to get a job, right?
Yeah.
So what were some of the things, not to call out early things that you did in your career, because I don't think it's 100% necessary, but like what are some of the things that you realized very quickly were true before you got started in tech as a career versus were not true?
Mhm. Well, the first thing I'll answer and then pause with is what you described, fundamentals. Every time I learned a deep concept, it made higher level things easier or less difficult. Like once I, in the C++ curriculum, understood the concept of free floating memory, of cleaning up my memory after myself, it made those annoying little memory issues just so much less confusing to debug. So I tried to get in the habit early on of whenever I need to do something, I learn the fundamentals, the principles underneath it, whether it's like a
Hmm.
library's best practices or like a language's how does the runtime work, before I try to like really excel at the higher level things.
Yeah. So here's a question then. Like as you know, getting the understanding of the foundational or the fundamentals is really valuable. My question then becomes like, at least for you, what is the best way that you learn in these regards? Because I think one thing that's very clear is that if you're getting started learning a new technology, like the options are almost limitless, right? With varying degrees of effectiveness depending on the quality of the content, your ability to absorb that particular medium, so on and so forth, right? So like for you, like what is the best way that you learn new things?
It's funny. Everyone is different in what works best for them. And even taking a step back, the strategy you take to determine which things are best for you in any particular area that is best is different person to person.
Sure.
Personally, for code, I work best by reading technical descriptions and doing,
Mm.
generally at the same time. So I learned pretty quickly, like when I was trying to learn React, videos do not go well with me. I can't pay attention to the whole thing. I need to be able
Yeah.
to skim back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But like a book, a long like React.dev style walkthrough, wow, beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that for me was very much like I part of what got me into open source so much was that I needed to be constantly coding within the time spent trying to learn because that was the most effective way for me to do things and a good way to find projects that gave me new stimulus, new things to learn was to go online on GitHub and find
Yeah.
different things that I could contribute to.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, and it maybe just be my taste has changed because I personally like watching videos to learn things. But your point about like it's hard to follow along when you're like typing in a terminal or a code window and watch a video at the same time. It's very very challenging. It's much easier to like have a doc or a GitHub repo like pinned, and then you can kind of look at it as you see fit, right? Uh, but I mean, maybe it's the ADHD in me. Like reading stuff becomes very, very challenging after like 5 minutes. I tend to get distracted very easily, especially if, let's be fair, like docs, technical white papers, blogs, like longer blogs, like for the most part, like they're not like the most exciting reading, right?
Yeah. That's plus one to the ADHD. Yay. Yeah, that's why I found it most useful to be doing that while coding. If I have a goal in mind, I can power towards that goal.
Mm,
So if I have a problem, if I'm trying to figure out what's the right way to do this new thing, or it's broken, how do I fix? Then I
sure.
can go to the docs with a lot more intense and like self-motivating power than if I'm just, opening the docs page afresh and trying to read. Because yeah, that latter bit, the just reading something new for no particular pointed reason, also does not work really well for me.
Yeah.
But again, that's just me. Everyone is
Yeah.
different.
No, and I think that's fair too. I think what's really important, and I tell this to people that are getting started in tech, like you have to feel the pain. Like there has to be like some level of like, you know, understanding that things aren't going to be super easy the first time you look
Yeah.
at something, right? And I think I do that in an effort to level set with folks because there is this opinion that like, oh, like you're either a good developer or a bad developer, right? And I don't agree with that. There's many levels of developers. I think also too, like if you don't find interest to back about like how we learn, like if you're working on stuff or trying to learn something you're not interested in, like good luck. Like I've joked a thousand times about trying to learn Go. I've tried to learn Go like 20 times, and I have gone through the process. I go through the docs, and I have like an app that I can do, and then I look at it the next day and not know what any of it means, because for whatever reason, like it doesn't bring me joy. And not to say that building things in Go isn't exciting for some. That's definitely true because if you look at Go, it's quite popular. But for me specifically, it doesn't strike the right chord for me. So it kind of just disappears after I learn it. Are you similar like that with technology? Like, have you recalled like trying to learn something and then just given up because of just lack of interest over a course of time?
Absolutely. And this is part of why I really hate a lot of the vitriol online around X is bad or Y is good,
Oh yeah,
because things are different for different people. People's brains work differently. Ironically, I did very poorly in the parts of the like programming languages theory class I took in university that ended up being stuff I now use day to day in a lot of the open
sure,
source projects that I
sure.
maintain around dev tooling. But yeah, some things just did not click. And if you try something and it doesn't work and you try it again, it still doesn't work, maybe that is a potential sign that, okay, this is not
Yeah.
a thing for you in particular. Like I mentioned earlier, I've tried hardware, I've tried 3D printing, I've tried building a computer, and I'm not motivated intrinsically enough to overcome the fact that that is a foreign concept to my brain. Just
Yeah.
hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I think also too, like the dopamine hit of completing something successfully, right? Like that is very very powerful, and I think one of the things people are able to process a lot of struggle or a lot of obstacles if they know what the feeling of success looks like. I think that's a human nature thing in a lot of cases. We all like to feel dopamine. So when you're struggling and when you're building things, this is kind of a weird segue, but I'm curious. When you're struggling with something, like what are some of the coping mechanisms you use to, I guess, get on the right track? Because knowing that like I can't give up because I know that when I'm done with this, it's gonna feel really good.
A few different things. First of all, question that. Is it worth it? Like, do you really need to
Mm-hmm.
finish this task? Like a lot of people I've talked to are trying to either learn how to code or learn how to do a specific area of code, and they don't actually have good motivation for doing that. It's just someone told me this is a good idea. Uh, I have a mentee who was really, I think, well suited to back end work. That's just like what she wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
But her team at work tended to be more front end, so she just kept trying to do React and TypeScript instead of Rails backend, and it just didn't work for her. That's just not what she was intrinsically motivated to do. That's not the problem space she wanted to work in. And so as soon as she would go back to the back end, the front end stuff would fade away, and she'd
Mm-hmm.
be a star performer and do great on the back end.
Sure.
And at that point, like, okay, clearly this is a sign that maybe you're where you're meant to be when you're working in the back end. But no, if it is a problem that I really want to solve, that I'm having a hard time with, a few strategies are sleep on it, make sure that my physical state is good. Like I've learned, especially the last few years, the value of the holy trinity of diet, exercise, and sleep,
Mm-hmm.
always being good. Um, Figuring out if there's a specific pain point, is there a resource I'm not using to resolve that pain point? Oftentimes that'll be like reading the docs or finding a different material that speaks better to me, or just asking for help. It's really important to have someone or some community that you can ask for help when you get stuck. I think humans are social creatures for good reason. We
Yeah.
can we can build on things for each other. So I don't know. That's kind of my general strategy. It's should I be doing this in the first place? Am I well equipped to do it? Am I getting the right resources? Do I need to ask someone for help?
Yeah. No, that I mean that's a really again, and I don't know you very well, but I feel like you enjoy plotting the steps to an end goal. Like maybe a little bit of the analytical thing because it makes more sense in your brain, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a bit more chaotic where I like to run left as fast as I can and then run right as fast as I can and then I run into whatever I'm trying to solve. Um, do you think, and here's another interesting question, do you think that there's a certain kind of personality that is more suited for a technical person?
No. I think that there are enough different things you could do in tech and enough different strategies you can take that a lot of different mind archetypes or combinations of archetypes do well. Like I, for example, do sometimes like enjoy the chaotic strategy of just I'm going to try this and then it doesn't
Yeah.
work. I'm going to try that. They're all valuable. It goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier about trying the right way or the best way to learn things. There's a lot of value in failing and
Mhm.
trying something and seeing how it does or doesn't work. So as long as you are gaining experience, the important bit is that you retain that experience and that you got it in the first place, not that you took the optimal strategy. I would even say that it is not just valuable, but in some cases extremely important for people to fail in certain ways. Like having a good versus mediocre versus bad manager really helps you understand what it is that makes a manager good, mediocre,
Yes.
or bad, and then prepares you to be one yourself if you want to be a manager later on. Or honestly, just helps you understand that you don't want to be one, which is currently the case for me.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the notion that we figure out what we enjoy, and we should do our damnedest to try to like continue to do those things that we enjoy, knowing that nine times out of 10, the things that we're doing to make money or to bring business value aren't probably super exciting. But for that one or two things out of 10, really carry those with you, because at the end of the day, 99% of developers, like they have some data source, they need to build some UI on top of it, more than likely,
Yeah.
right? So like, like the idea that like it's just a different way to show data, or a simpler or a different way to work against data, right? So moving on our conversation a little bit from like just general technology to more open source technology, it's like, what was your first introduction to open source? Like, when do you first remember like the idea or the concept of like quote unquote free code on the internet or open code on the internet?
Hmm. Let's think. I I mean, when you start coding in a lot of college curriculums, they introduce you to the concept of open source, and for us, it was C++. Talking about how there's the STL, this open source thing. Oh my God, everyone can see your code. Wow. But for me, the first big project I did in it was my own called Full Screen Mario, which I posted online as open source, sheerly out of convenience that at the time GitHub was a nice free code host.
Yep.
And it went viral, which was really nice, very, very useful for me in my career. It was like a full remake of the original Super Mario Brothers, all 32 levels, random map editor, random map, comma space level editor, mods, API. Not legal, so Nintendo took it
Mm.
down. But that gave me a lot of exposure first to see something go mini micro viral on Reddit and Twitter, and also to experience what it's like to have people suggest changes to your code, to point out
Yeah.
in retrospect obvious flaws, or to explain to you, hey, you're not using any linting or type checking or whatever like that. Your code is, and I'm quoting here, trash,
Yeah.
and other more politely phrased variants of that. So
Mm.
it was a really useful experience, and this was in 2013.
Yeah, so that's fascinating to me. Like, you know, going viral is very interesting. Like the whole thought, because then you have like all of these new opinions that you have to kind of grok, right? And I don't know
Yeah.
if you're similar to like this. We can talk a little bit about your mindset as a maintainer in a little bit, but I'd like to get your thoughts. Like, do you typically, the first thing that you see when you get some sort of feedback, like, do you take it as feedback or do you take it as an affront to you personally?
I would love to find a maintainer who is successful in being a maintainer and takes things
Yes.
personally as like the first round.
Yeah.
No, I always try to distill down any piece of feedback, whether it's a tweet, post, toot, whatever we're calling them, wherever, or a Discord chat or issue, as what is the intent behind it. Oftentimes, people aren't practiced in phrasing things online. I've certainly made the mistake of saying something I thought was like a friendly joke and was actually kind of rude. And then also there are people who are using translators or broken
Hmm.
English. It's not their first language. Like I don't want to be disrespectful and rude to them and devalue their valuable feedback. So oftentimes we'll get an issue on one of my projects and I will spend the 30 seconds to get out of the mindset of, oh my God, they just said everything is terrible and I'm an idiot, to see what the actual issue is. But then, of course, when you distill feedback down to its intent, sometimes that intent is negative. So after we get through the process of responding appropriately, applying the right label, won't fix, accepting PRs, ask for clarification, whatever, I'll then also in my mind evaluate, okay, is this setting a bad precedence for the repo? Are they personally insulting us in a way that should be shut down politely? And thankfully, that's been very rare. I haven't worked on too many open source projects that get a lot of hatred. But once
Yeah.
in a while, it does happen that we just need to tell people, look, this is not how you participate in online discourse. It's not healthy and it's not productive.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I've always found absolutely fascinating about software and the developer community or technology community at large is similar to human nature. We all are very opinionated. And it's always interesting seeing somebody who has a different opinion to you trying to convince you that their opinion is superior to yours, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as
Yeah.
somebody who's a maintainer, I imagine you've seen this a million times where somebody will go and they'll spend a ton of time and they'll open up a PR and they're just basically just, you know, changing variable names, or they're kind of refactoring in a particular way that brings them developer joy. But it doesn't really bring you any value valuable as a maintainer other than, okay, now I have to maintain code that I didn't write at all. So what is your thought around, code contribution? Obviously, I know that we talked about this a bit earlier, like you have contributing guidelines, but in general, do you welcome most contribution? Are you a bit timid to it because knowing that you will have to support that for the rest of your life, in quotes, right? What's your general thought about contributing from folks that aren't already a part of the community? Like, for instance, somebody that you've never talked to or has never, had general discourse with you, with some of your projects that you maintain.
This is why we have well-defined contribution flows, where it's very rare that I get a pull request that's just change variable names or refactor with no end user benefit. That doesn't get linked to an existing accepting PR's issue asking for that. Because in our contribution guidelines, we say, please don't send a PR for anything more than a minor docs typo fix
Mm-hmm.
unless there is an issue already. And if you want to change something, file an issue. But let's go back to the strategy of distilling intent. Suppose someone sends a PR that refactors a bunch of code, let's just say small things like variable names and maybe splits a function in twain or something. Um, is their intent just to get a Hacktoberfest contribution?
Yeah.
If so, comment on it saying, hey, this is not how Hacktoberfest work. This is not useful. You're wasting my time, in nicer words, etc. Is their intent that they think your code is sloppy and it would be easier for people to develop in general, or the way they might phrase it, better with this change? If that's the case, then I'll take a look at the change. Is it better? Unless it's clearly better, I'll say, hey, this isn't something we agreed to. Please file an issue. But sometimes it is okay to break the process. Processes are only useful as long as they are serving a purpose, as long as they're
Yes.
useful. So if their code change is legitimately better, yeah, I'll take it in. And I realized, by the way, that I've answered slightly differently in direction than what you asked. The question I think was also around, people send code. Do I feel welcoming? Like, do I want to take on the burden of maintaining this code? And the answer is always yes, as long as it's worth the pain, which is almost always yes.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's a huge change that like drastically changes something in a way that was not agreed upon, or is very different from what I thought would be agreed upon, then yeah, let's augment the project. As part of reviewing your code, I need to understand it, which gives me the context. And honestly, code is code. I'll probably forget the entire project's code over the next 6 months anyway if I'm
Yeah.
currently contexted up on it. So it doesn't really make a difference if I'm relearning your code versus relearning mine, as long as it adheres to the general same style patterns.
Yeah, I think that's a very healthy way to think about it. I mean, I at times I think probably think about things a more unhealthy way. Like my big thing has always been like, okay, so you want to contribute. I welcome contribution. I do these things. However, like, what's in it for me? Like, maybe that's probably not the way to think about it. But what am I getting as a maintainer? What benefit am I getting from taking your PR, right? Because
Yeah.
What I've seen a lot, and not just in the things that I've maintained, but things that I follow or things that I've been ancillary to, is like this idea of, somebody open up an issue because they have a particular use case that isn't working for reasons, right? And then they'll give you a PR, but the thing that they want is just a small part of that PR. And then you have to have a conversation with that individual about like, okay, so what problem are you trying to solve with all the rest of this? Well,
Yeah.
I use Prettier, or and you get a bunch of weird editor changes, things like that. So how often, and this might be these drill a bit in the weeds about how you interact with contributors, But is it one of those things where you before you even look at a PR, you need to have like an actual conversation with somebody typically? Is that like one way to success for somebody who would like to, join or contribute to your projects?
It's a great question. I hesitate to imply that we should be having large scale conversations quite so often in open source because the fact that you need to have a large conversation with someone indicates that your tooling, your guidelines were not sufficient to resolve whatever questions or topics they
Mm,
wanted to come up with. And most of the time, it's always the same things. It's like you just said, they introduce a different formatter or they have some different editor config file or something. So a few thoughts there. One is this is part of why I really enjoy working as a full-time independent open source maintainer in the dev tooling space because I get to see all these different wacky things people put into
yeah,
or suggest for repos and PRs and build them into my templates. So there should, in my space, never be a question of, oh, have you considered using this tool? That's not immediately answered by, here's the tracking issue of whether we decided for or against it. And if it was for, here's the PR or just the accepting PRs label. And then also PRs, I generally ask to be single purpose. If I have to review your code, I want to be able to review granular pieces of them in one PR per each area of change so that we can get them in sooner. It's easier to review. If we have to revert later on, I don't have to revert all the things. And just for paperwork, for housekeeping, it's easier both in the soft side because I can now keep track of granular issues and PRs when I go back through the repo and through the automation side because in most or all of my repos soon, I'll have automated releases, commit attribution, little all contributors table in the README. So I want to be able to get you your contribution counts, the different types
sure.
automatically. So it's just a pain in the butt if someone sends a giant PR with more than what's asked for. I'll almost
Yeah.
always ask them to split it up.
Yeah, here's another question in general about maintaining, I don't want to say, heavily used or well known, like maintaining a project that has some visibility. What I see occasionally is people that are coming from other similar or competing projects and saying, "Oh, project X, which is a direct, somewhat similar to what you have, has this, like you need to add this functionality." So, the question becomes like how often do you look at other projects that are similar to yours but are more opinionated in a particular way? And how often do you look at them and say, oh, they might be doing something right, or oh, I don't quite agree with that, but if it works for them, it works for them, or even like, oh, I should probably look to adopt something like that as a part of my project?
Constantly. And I wish more people did this. When you are working in industry, it can become competitive. You have two companies that do a similar thing. It's a zero-sum game in that, they want to destroy each other. But in open source, our goals are different. Oftentimes our goals are not to secure more money from people. Our goals are to make things better for everyone. That's my personal goal. It's why I'm in the dev tooling space. I want our industry to be as efficient and productive as possible because I think it's better for the world if software costs less. It means we can technologically advance further, and it's less of a pain in the butt for me to have bugs and annoyances at dev time.
Sure.
So if I see two projects, let's say there's TypeScript-eslint, the main one that I work on, which is linting for TypeScript, the plugin and rules for ESLint that allow that. And then let's say that someone else comes up with their own linter. These days, everyone's writing the linter in Rust or similar, so that's the competition piece. I will look at them in a very friendly way and think, okay, what's best for the industry? Right now, TypeScript-eslint is the most powerful linter for TypeScript code out there because it's written in JavaScript TypeScript. It pulls in information from the TypeScript type checker. Whereas other competitors to ESLint and TypeScript-eslint, tend to be the fastest or among the fastest linters
Mm.
because they're written in Rust or similar. And those are two competing concerns, and we haven't been able to resolve them. We haven't been able to get a super fast, speedy Rust linter that also pulls in TypeScript type information. No one has gotten that to work. So we look at the different features. We look at, what do the users actually want? And we try to make it great for everyone. In our side, we're always looking at performance. On their side, long term, they hope to, get TypeScript type information. But I don't ever like hearing people phrase, you didn't do this, I just, in theory, I don't like hearing people phrase competitiveness in open source that, React is punishing Angular for XYZ
Mm.
or Solid is
Yeah.
destroying React. We're all contributing to a better understanding of the problem space and improved tooling. And we're constantly learning from each other. It's a beautiful collaborative environment, like a cooperative game rather than a competitive.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's it's lost on folks too is most open source or most projects, they didn't start out as I'm going to create the thing that everybody uses. They usually
Yeah.
have a task they're looking to solve, whether it be for a personal project or something related to their work, and they build something and then they realize at some point, oh, this might be valuable to other people. And that's when I guess you can say the floodgates open, because something that was like my little project that made Isaac happy or Josh happy, now I have this responsibility to ensure everybody who uses it is happy. And does that weigh on you at times? And the reason why I ask is because I think, bringing the personal aspect of this, because you are investing your time, it is your livelihood. Do you feel like you have some sort of um, responsibility to make users happy, or is it simply if people use it, great. If they don't use it, great. I'm going to build things that I think are going to be the most valuable for this project.
It's a great question. I don't know that it's answerable. Um, there's so many factors here. Like, yeah, in theory, open source is free software. So in theory, I should be able to just publish something and say, if you want it, great. If you want to change it, well, it's up to me. And if I don't like your changes, you can go F off. But I gain a lot of benefit from publishing things in open source. Like I gain notoriety. I now actually am financially compensated a little bit. Not as much as I want, but better than minimum wage now. Um, so like how much ownership, how much responsibility does a maintainer have for a project? I don't know. It's hard to say. I think in general, my mindset is I each tool has a goal, and if you're trying to position the tool, if you're trying to advertise it as satisfying a goal, you should learn from your users how they interpret that goal. If the tool is, let's say, a plugin to make sure that you have one sentence per line in your markdown files for easier Git diffs, and your users are saying, well, my sentences end with exclamation marks, or, well, I want to limit at 2 lines. Figure out like how much of this is something you actually want to take
Yeah.
on. Um, and honestly, at the end of the day, if you don't have the time and there's no one else stepping up to be a maintainer, it's totally reasonable to say, no, this project does not encompass that scope. You are free to fork it and or make your own
Hmm.
repository. Boom.
Yeah. The free to fork thing is always interesting to me because I see this happen a lot where someone will fork something and for whatever reason that fork takes off and becomes something of its own and people go to that fork. And then people will go back to the original project and say, hey, this thing in this forked project that I'm using doesn't work, and I think it's because of you. What is your thought around not just supporting your own projects, but being a downstream dependency of another project?
Hmm. Well, where does the ownership lie?
Mm-hmm.
Person A makes library A1. Person B makes fork B1. Person C relies on B1. The ownership is pretty clearly B, therefore
Mm-hmm.
the responsibility is on B. Um, we should also question why the fork happened in the first place. Was the fork because the original project was out of maintenance? In that case, is the original project something that should be archived and sunset? Have we reached out to maintainers? Is the fork because the community believed that they had a better or more correct or just different and better for their use case understanding of the goal?
Or it showed up in
Um,
NPM higher. That's a
yeah,
thing too.
yeah.
You see that all the time,
There
right?
were Yeah, yeah. Someone just doesn't search for a project that's in
Yeah.
existence. It's not even a fork. It's just a coincidental, convergent evolution. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to say in the abstract. I think in general, both in social media discourse and in open source, along with their intersections, um, being kind gets you far, and trying to
Mm.
understand people's intent will also get you far. So it's very rare that there's some kind of dilemma or debate or problem that isn't solved by getting people together with an open mind and discussing nicely. If one or both sides of an issue or multiple sides are not able to do that for whatever reason, then that's when you really get into problem territory.
Yeah, I totally agree too. I think also like the humanity behind open source is I'm glad that it's becoming more visible because I do feel like there was a point in time where people would just openly take from open source without any uh, obligation to contribute back, even if it's monetarily. Like I think that that's
Yeah.
something too, and I'd like to talk about that as well. Like, you know, I'm a huge advocate of contribute any way that you can to open source. If it's contributing code, awesome. If you don't feel comfortable contributing to code, there are docs, there are tests, there are all sorts of things that are like in repo, like you actually putting hands on keyboards to solve. But there's another way to contribute to projects, and that's via some form of sponsorship. Knowing that you part of your livelihood is tied to sponsorships. Like, what was some of the factors that went through your mind as you were deciding to make a choice? Like, oh, I'm going to quote unquote live off of sponsorships in some way. I know that that's not the only way. Like, I'm not stupid, but like, it is part of how you of your livelihood. So, what was some of the decision making that went into that?
Oh, thank heavens I'm married. I don't have to worry about health insurance in the United States. Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah,
That
that's
was
a thing
actually
too.
a big factor. Oh, love this country. Yeah, so part of it was that I thought that I'd be able to make it work. And I think that a lot of people would not be able to make full-time open source work financially, because you need to really work at it before you get into it. You have to build a career just to get the experience, to
Hmm.
understand how to work with people, to get experience working in technologies, to know how they work, to work with uh, companies, to know how they work. Networking is real important, so much more important than I want it to be. Like I spend a lot of time. I'm personally enjoying this right now, but like the goal of this for me in the abstract is to network with you, to enjoy
Hmm.
myself, and to get my opinions and name out there,
Yep.
candidly. Um, yeah, I think right now, as you said, people are discovering that yeah, you should and could monetarily contribute. I think long term, there are a couple changes I'd like to see continue to happen in the industry. One is I'd like people to put more societal pressure on organizations that make money to sponsor open source. It doesn't have to be that you figure out the exact companies and projects you want to sponsor or get sponsored from. You can use services like Tidelifts, ThanksDev, Stackade that you just give a lump sum to and they distribute amongst your dependencies. Those are great. I would also love to see some kind of, I don't know, like unified community. There have been a few efforts at this, like GitHub has one or two initiatives. There's the informal open source community, but I think there's a lot of knowledge that's kind of fragmented around what are the good and bad ways to do fundraising, to ask for
Yes.
money, to
Hmm.
to build sponsorship programs. So I think this is totally natural. By the way, we're an early stage effort, an early stage industry understanding, and it's going to evolve in a very fragmented way over the next few decades as we figure things out. So I would just love to fast forward to 2040, 2050, where
Sure.
it's
Yeah,
much more
and
resolved than now.
like you think of how other industries do solve the similar problem, grant writing or corporate sponsorships in that regard. Like, if anybody's ever been to like a museum or a zoo or aquarium, right? Yes, they make money on tickets,
Yeah,
but that's like 3% of their operating income, right? Like the rest of it is corporations or the government or whatever it is, right? um, you mentioned something that I think is very interesting about like societal pressure on large organizations, right? I think what's very interesting is that when you look at the public discord, it seems to be like, oh, big tech company Y needs to contribute more to projects. And I am more of the side, big company Y is already doing a lot. What about some
yeah,
random company in another industry that's not tech, right?
yeah,
Like, you don't see, I'm not going to put any company on blast, but you don't see companies from the insurance industry or the aviation industry or the banking
yeah,
industry or whatever. You don't see them publicly talking about open source tech and how it helps them make billions of dollars in revenue per year, right? Um,
yeah,
I would love to see more around that. The problem is that typically there isn't any pressure on those companies because they're not in the existing communities. They're just users of free software. That's an over exaggeration, but that's kind of where I'm at.
no, it's true.
And I think one of the things that's going to, using your 2040 barometer, right? Like, is there going to be more pressure? The big tech companies go to their customers, or something happens where large organizations all of a sudden like, hey, if you have software on the internet, you're taking advantage of some technology you didn't build yourself, so you should sponsor those technologies. And I'd love to get your thoughts as to like, do you agree with that sentiment? Like, big tech is doing a lot. They could do more. Everybody can do more, obviously. But big tech is at least doing something. It's the rest of, you know,
Yeah.
rest of capitalism or consumerism that we need to actually put the pressure on.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, actually. It's something I wanted to talk about. First of all, yep, we live in a capitalist world. No ethical consumption. So always we're going to be trying to bolt something good on top of a system that's inherently just profit driven. Yeah, so a few ideas that have been floating around. We could make a tax. I don't know how that would work, but like a tax on profits, on open source software usage, something. And then that tax, you could, discount the tax for if you actually do contribute to open source. How we compute what a contribution is monetarily and or non-monetarily, time, that's a difficult question. Another similarly difficult question would be, could we make like a ranking system? Like, are you gold star certified the way a restaurant is an A or B for hygiene? In the way you interact with open source, do you contribute enough time and or money per your usage or number of developers or profits or something? Is this something a government could standardize? Is this something that the community would need to iterate on for a long time before it becomes formalized? I don't know. Could we even, I wanted to make a project called Open Contributions. I don't think any of us have time for it, where we just like make a resource online to showcase companies doing open source as a first step towards ranking or thanking them. And then I think something I'd love to see is like a certification similar to how companies are accessibility certified.
Yep.
Or can be, or like self-disclosed, where there's a certain set of things you need to do. Like, yes, we sponsor our dependencies. Yes, we don't fork without, attempting to contribute back features or bug fixes. And then as a final step to that, making that a requirement to work with a government or state or education type of sector, that you need to be certain level of accessibility and or open source certified. I don't know. These are all really interesting, open, new questions like within the last few decades, and we're nowhere near solving any of them. But I would love to see more discussion around how do we incentivize companies the right way to do the right thing when just because like big tech companies need to hire the best devs. They always want the best of us, and we are all, some of us, yelling about open source, but like travel, fashion, insurance, non-e-commerce, just commerce in person, much less motivated to get the top tier, top end devs.
Yeah, and there's a lot of extenuating circumstances too, as to like, a lot of feedback that I hear from companies like, well, tech isn't our core competency. Tech is just how we interact with our customers. Well, isn't that your core competency then? Like, I mean, I think I've heard this a million times. Like, every company is a tech company, right? Like, at the end of the day, all of us store our data in some technology. All of us use miscellaneous entry points for our customers to engage with our company. And it is very interesting. And I do agree with you that there's a lot of roadblocks, but I feel like we're slowly marching down this path of getting enough groundswell where we could maybe institute some change in the next 20 years. Maybe I'm being a bit optimistic there, but I think there is a bit of an onus too on the faces of technology faces as in companies, to call that out. Like, I've seen companies that they contribute to open source on behalf of their customers, which is an interesting take, right?
Yeah.
Because the customer doesn't know about that. Like, it's just the company doing goodwill or whatever, right? It is a fascinating conversation. And one of the things that, I'd like to end on as we're trying to end our conversation is like, what is, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the tech community, as somebody who engages in the open source communities as well, like, what are some of the things that you see that are happening that bring you optimism for the future of technology? Because I think a lot of things, when you talk about tech Twitter or tech social media or, company layoffs and all these things, like working in tech, it sometimes can be quite saddening in a lot of regards. It's like, what are some of the things that you're optimistic about that you've seen over the last few years regards to tech and open source in general?
Great question. Love it. I think that the frameworks and libraries, like the real important big ones, are learning more and more how to interact both with users and with each other. I mean, if you look back to the common phrasing that people made around, say, React versus Angular back in the day, there was a lot of competitiveness, and the teams weren't at least publicly talking with each other quite as much. not saying they were in, anger, competition, war, but compared to today, where folks from React and Solid and Vue and Svelte are all on good terms online. At least it seems. I'm not an insider myself.
Sure.
And learning from each other. Like Ryan Carniato, the Solid person, is constantly praising React and explaining, well, this is what it does well. This is what we prefer to do in Solid. And that, I think, lends itself really well to the industry better understanding how frameworks, libraries, platforms shift, evolve, and improve over time. So I'm excited. It feels like there's an exponentially increasing speed, velocity of improvement, and AI, of course, will help with that. So my hope is that in 10, 15 years, we're going to be developing things 3x, 10x the speed and stability of what we are today.
I totally agree. I think as one thing that you mentioned about the AI thing is very interesting to me, because like AI acting as just another tool to use, right?
Yeah.
And we talk about AI in a negative light now, but I agree. In 5 years, AI will we'll be talking about it from a positive light only, because I think that a lot of the scare factor will wear off, and you're already starting to see that a lot with a lot of tooling that is quite useful, actually.
Yeah, there's a Gartner hype cycle in play, right? I just want to interrupt here because I want to be really clear.
Yeah.
I am not super excited about AI right now. I recognize it's got a lot of flaws, and I've been constantly complaining about people overusing it. But like, it is a great tool, not a driver, but a tool that we can use. Yeah. Plus one to that.
Yeah. Like I mean, I don't want to hawk for one of them, but like I like that the name of a product called Copilot is very interesting, because like the idea that it's not doing your job, it's helping you augment your job or abstract your job or whatever you want to call it, to allow you to focus on things that only you can solve, right? And I think that's a great way to think about it. It's not a replacer; it's something to help you lean on when you don't have the time or the capacity or the resources or whatever to do everything.
Yeah.
So, as we wrap up, I'd love to finish this conversation, with one final question. And, we've been talking for about an hour, and we've talked about, your career in technology, some different areas of, the socioeconomic factors of technology. And I'd love to get your thoughts. Like, if you had one word, when you think about all these things we've discussed over the last hour, and you only one word, what would that word be for you, Josh?
Like, to describe me?
No, just to describe the feeling that you have, the tech in general, open source in general. You had one word that comes to mind when you think about these things.
Probably excitement. I get excited about things. I'm kind of a natural pessimist in ways, but I think long term, I mean, even just looking at how the industry has advanced while I've been here, like barely a decade, if that, it's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the fact that it's only getting better. Like, I can speak for tech when I started out right out of school. I believe tech is better now than it was then. There's far more noise now, but I think that we're moving in a positive direction the right way. And I love this conversation. I thought that, we hit a couple of really interesting topics, and I'm really glad that you spent some time chatting with me. If you're curious to learn more about Josh, you can find him on Twitter. It's Joshua K. Goldberg. So that's JOSHUAKGOLDBERG. Josh K. Goldberg. And there'll be a link to some other ways you can find what Josh is doing. Also, there'll be a link to his book in there. And if you're interested in that particular area of world, the TypeScript world, I highly recommend you take a look at his book. I've only heard great things. Yeah. And with that, Josh, do you have any parting words before we sign off?
Not much. This was a pleasure. I agree. Thank you. It's always nice to talk to people who have like a deep understanding and insight into the industry and open source. Always happy to talk to people about open source, TypeScript dev, stuff like that. Joshua K. Goldberg on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Fastodon, Bluesky.com. And I'm probably forgetting one or two things. But yeah, always happy to chat.
Yeah, you had to do what I do. You had to add the middle name or the middle initial to make sure that you got it everywhere, right?
Yep, exactly.
So annoying. Anyway, well, this was great. Thank you so much for being on the show, Josh. It was a pleasure. And thank you folks for tuning in right now. And thanks for listening in the future. This is Isaac Levin from Coffee and Open Source. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.